But it's the standard format.
Hello everybody, so should we make a start? Thanks ever so much for coming today to the National Leather Collection, and welcome to the Being Human Festival of the Humanities. This is something that's taking place across 50 towns and cities across the UK over these couple of weeks. Being Human is the only national festival dedicated entirely to celebrating research across the humanities, from archaeology, history, languages, philosophy and more. This year the festival is exploring the theme of origins and endings. So yesterday we heard about leather and national identity. Tomorrow we're hearing about archaeology. Today we're going to think about the origins of leather in a slightly different way. So Being Human's run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Please do help us improve the festival and this event for future years. We put some feedback forms out on the chairs. If you could please fill one out before you go and leave it with us, that would be really appreciated. Thank you very much. So my name is Matthew McCormack. I'm from the History Department here at the University at Northampton. I'm delighted to be organising the festival with my colleagues at the National Leather Collection today. Today's lecture is by Dr. Mike Redwood. Mike is a leather technician with a long experience in the leather industry and is also a visiting professor at the University of Northampton. So, take it away, Mike.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon. If you've walked across here from the door, you've probably got a really good feeling for how ubiquitous leather is, how it's just everywhere in our society and life. And it has been all through history. And certainly until the 20th century, leather and leather-using industries were one of the top 3 industries in the world for centuries and centuries. If you go back in time, 3 million years, for example, to when the apes first began to walk upright and think about making journeys. I've put this picture of Lucy from Ethiopia up. One, because I've seen her, 2, because Ethiopia is a really important place for leather today, and it has been for at least 3,000 years. And that was where she was found, although they're making new finds of ancient people now all the time. But what we do know is that as soon as mankind something to put on their feet. They needed something to help them move into different climates, some form of clothing. And if they didn't have lots of trees or lots of caves, they needed some form of tent as shelter. And the only sheet material which they had, of course, were hides and skins. Until we had worked out how to make woven textiles, there was no other sheet material. A sheepskin on its own nowadays is about a square metre, 10 square feet. They seem to be saying in those days the animals were bigger, so a bit more. A cattle hide now is probably, depending where it comes from, an Ethiopian cattle hide, 35, 40 square feet, so 3 to 4 square metre. And in our climate here, very much bigger than that, and you get the mammoths and things like that, you're into much bigger materials. So these were big sheets of material and very, very useful. The amazing thing about leather, this is a cross section that I took yesterday of this standard old piece of leather, like most of what you'll see around here. And that's just a cross section. And right at the very top is where the hairs went in, so that's that layer that's slightly grey at the top. And then this mane are a really, really strong network of collagen fibres that make leather and our skins so clever. And although it varies enormously from one animal to another, that collagen, that sort of structure, you can get in every animal and in a lot of fishes and in some birds. So we can tan anything, and historically we tanned everything because as a society we were short of materials and we did use everything. We're choosy now, and of course now leather is pretty strictly, apart from tiny exceptions, a byproduct of the meat and dairy industry. So everything that we use today comes dependent upon whether we want to keep livestock for meat and milk and cheese and butter. This structure scientifically looks a bit like that. So you can see this fabulous network down here, and then the very thin layer at the top, which is a bit exaggerated in this picture, so you can see that's where the hairs come in. But that thickness varies whether it's a pig skin or a sheep skin or a cattle hide or a buffalo. But that's common to absolutely every animal. So when ancient man were finding the hides and skins, whatever they were for, this is the material, fantastically strong, fantastically durable. So just as rawhides, it was a very, very useful material. It did have the difficulty that it was full of bacteria that would eat it away. But you could stop that happening if you dried it. The problem if you dried it is it became a bit stiff and it became inflexible. And so they had to work out ways to use it. Staying in Ethiopia, this is a town called Lalibela that those of you who know has 10 underground churches carved out of individual solid pieces of sandstone. It's a fabulous World Heritage Site, and the feeling is that they were built by the Knights Templar. So this is one of the really historical royal spots in Ethiopia, going back a long way into history. And these are all rawhide, including the little bit of rope and rein which he's holding there. And if you begin to build ropes, and you can intertwine them to make some very strong reins, ropes and things. And that's what we clearly did in history and are still doing in places like Ethiopia today. And we have a coracle over there which is of tanned leather, but a lot of coracles were made of rawhide, including quite recently, and well actually currently, if you go to Tibet and catch a taxi from the airport down into Lhasa, you get a surprise as you pass down the river. You see this great round boat, which is a coracle made of yak hides. And in the olden days, these boats weren't just the sort of two-man, three-man thing that we think of as a coracle, that you would go fishing or cross a river. The ones in Tibet held 10 people and 2 yak. And they were common. You come down, as you do exactly in Tibet right now, you come down from the villages in the mountain with all your produce to sell, and you bring it down, and if you meet the rapids, you can fold it up, it's very light, and you can walk with all your goods round the rapids and refloat it and carry on sailing. And if it does snag rocks, it's 1,000 times better than having an inflatable rubber dinghy, which isn't going to survive. And when you go back to the time of the Euphrates and into that ancient Middle Eastern area where trade and cities began, 3000 BC, you will see that they actually brought the produce from the mountains down into the valley on coracles made of hides. And at the bottom, they would throw away the wood, but carry the hides back up the mountains because they were precious and use them again on the next journey. And that's well scripted at the beginning of time. These rawhides were incredibly useful, just in their own right. And the first time I went to Lanzhou, which is over in western China, in Gansu province, the big yellow river, I saw people this was in the middle 1980s, I saw people sailing on a sort of raft across the river, and they still use them, although not so much today, but the university did try to copy this and sail it across the bay at Bridgewater by blowing up goatskins, raw goatskins, tying all the leg ends and blowing them up and making floats. And with 8 floats, you could make a little raft to go back and forward across the river. And that's what they've been doing on the Yellow River for many centuries. And we know of rawhide mostly in terms of parchment and vellum, the sort of books, quite a few of which you see. There's a page on the table there, and there's another book on the far side which says it's covered in white leather. Are we sure it's white leather? It looks to me like that might be parchment that covers that book, but certainly the contents are. The Codex Amiatinus, I think there's an I wrong at the beginning. I put that up because that book was written in Northumberland around 700, and they produced 3 of them, and 2 have been lost, and this one they were taking to Rome in 716, but the bishop died on the way, and it ended up, and it has ended up in Tuscany, and currently resides in in a library in Florence, and it's been brought to the British Library for an exhibition that's going on now. So I went for a look at it last week. It looks nice on the cover because it was rebound in the year 2000. It's 34 kilos in weight. What's that, about 70, 80 pounds in weight, 2 people to carry it. The pages are more than half a metre in length. There's 2,000 pages, 515 sheepskins in there, with a fabulous painting of Ezra on one of the early pages, which is the first time that we have a picture where somebody's actually displaying a library of books and going back. So it's a fantastic thing. Well, one of the places where parchment was used in its earliest time was, of course, in the Middle East, and we have a tiny fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls over there from Professor Reed, who actually was my tutor at university, and he was given the pieces to help identify them, and he obviously gave some to the museum when he retired. But at that same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls were being made, that was when we had the Queen of Sheba moving down into Ethiopia, and there was a lot of parchment produced there, and they still produce it now to produce these boxes. Which you can come, I'll just throw it down here to come look at that later. I did also buy an old one to see. I don't know how old it is. Maybe after tomorrow's DNA session we could know. Although I'd be a bit worried if it were really old, because then I wouldn't want to handle it. So this is dirty old parchment, and this is how they protect their religious books. And this is the Ethiopian Bible, because I think from about 300 AD, they were one of the first countries to adopt Christianity. And you can see it's beautifully scripted on Lake Tana, every page. And I hang on to this because about 5 years ago, they decided to start printing these books. So there's a whole area of technology and craftsmanship and skill is likely to die as they replace all these scribes in the monasteries and the little plants that make this lovely parchment and the goat skin for these covers. And again, I'll throw that out for you all to see if you're interested at the end. Now, some of my friends argue, well, of course, all this parchment stuff isn't really leather. Leather has to be prevented from putrefying, from deteriorating by being tanned, by having something put in to protect the fibres. But back in 1604, we passed an Act of Parliament in this country that actually said not only all the animals that they were regularly using here for high volumes of leather, but also that everything tanned or tawed. Tawed means treating with alum, which was particularly used by people like Shakespeare's dad to make glove leathers, and every salt hide, and the salt hide just had some salt thrown on it, and what that did, it didn't kill the bacteria, but in creating a brine inside the hide, it made an environment in which the bacteria were not active, so the hide was stable. So here they were saying, however you have your hide, raw or tanned, let's call that leather. And I think that's a fair description, because it's how we in society use the leather and use the hide and skin that has been, and still is to many degrees, so exciting. we still use rawhides. I think Mr. Cameron with his balloon company down in Wessex still puts rawhide pieces around the edges because it's the best material to mould round the edges for protecting the basket when it bounces on the ground when they're landing. Very, very abrasion resistant and very easy to mould round the edges. Hides and skins in their raw state are still very, very useful. What we saw in the way that mankind got hold of hides and skins and moved into leather was that we know in Lucy's time that they were eating meat. And we know that they pulled the more delicious animals back to their homesteads because we've got apparently the piles of bones of certain animal types. It wasn't just haphazard killing. But if you come forward to 1 million years ago into Java man, there it's been discovered they had fire, they cooked their meat, and they had a primitive axe for butchering and cleaning the hides. And some of them had skin shelters, a bit like you'll find if you go up to northern Scandinavia and you see some of the types of temporary dwellings that the nomadic people looking after the reindeer have all along north of over to Russia or into Mongolia with fires inside. And I mentioned that because the smoke from the fire has a tanning effect on the hide. It's an aldehyde, pretty much similar to the type of aldehydes that come out when you smoke, and sometimes people say you also get them when you're smoking these new mechanical cigarettes, that there's still acrolein coming out, and of course that tans your lungs. That's the worry apparently with that, but it certainly does start to tan the hide. So by accident they were discovering that you could give durability to the hide, and so when they moved it was very easy to fold the hides up and rebuild just exactly as you find they're still doing with the yurts in Mongolia. And then you come forward to 100,000 years ago and you get into specialist skinning, really good scraping tools, and some of those there's a display just over the other side of the room of the stone and the bone, and then the flint when we began to get sophisticated in this country, scraping tools that you had to clean the hides. And of course if you were scraping it, you're distributing all the fat from the inside, and that helps to soften the hide as well. And then when Homo sapiens arrived 35,000 years ago, they were getting really sophisticated in thinking about how to make leather out of it. We have these early tanning methods. The one at the top, vegetable materials, is about 90% of the leather you see in this room. And I think most of us who've been looking at the history and all the history books that you read kind of assume that we discovered how to make vegetable tanned leather very, very early on, and not so much of the other stuff actually happened. But I think we're now beginning to accept that that's wrong, that the other stuff was actually perhaps a lot more important than we thought, and that just because it's not so well tanned and hasn't lasted so long, we kind of assume it was less important because we don't have so many artifacts. So it becomes interesting. There's certainly alum, the oil and the fats, and brain and smoke, and when you start combining those bottom two, you can get some really clever and long-lasting tended to be overlooked in our research. Because if you start thinking about smoke, you must consider the Native Americans who used to have, and still in some instances do, and you can see them working on skins in Williamstown right now. They would have their teepee, often have a fire inside, so they would smoke the hide, but they learned that you could take the brain of the deer or the animal, which wasn't used for anything else, and you could wipe it over the inside of the skin, and the enzymes and the oil helped with the tanning and the softening effect. And if you mix on a deer skin, the wiping with the brain of that same deer skin and a bit of smoking, you can make a quite durable, quite waterproof, lovely and soft piece of leather, which lasts a long time. And I believe that item over here, this one here, is an Indian artifact. I cannot promise you that it is 100% brain tanned. If it is, it's in fantastic condition. But that is the tanning method that was used by the Native Indians. I've only seen lighter weight stuff made in recent years. That's thicker and stronger. But certainly the lighter weight stuff is the same colour, it's the same look. So it could well be, but I've not had the chance to actually interrogate that. And I don't think we've anybody in the room who has. Do you know, Victoria?
Afraid not.
You're assuming.
No expert.
But,
That's your job.
That is how the Native Americans made all their leather. And in America, when we went over in the 16th century and 17th century and set up our encampments in Plymouth and Massachusetts and St. Augustine, we took over vegetable tanning from Europe, and we viewed the native tanning as being quite primitive. But of course, in terms of our understanding of modern biotechnology, we perhaps made a mistake. There's a lot of knowledge in the use of the enzymes and these other materials. I'm not saying we should go out using brains to make everything right now, but those enzymes, I think, are now coming under a lot of investigation about how we can make artificial enzymes to do that work and make something particularly environmentally friendly, which would be an improvement on the excellent methods that we have now. And if you start coming forward to Otzi, Otzi was a gentleman who was wandering around the Alps between Italy and Austria, 3,300 BC, so 5,000 years ago, and his body came to the surface in the 1990s as the ancient snow was melting. I think maybe this was the beginning of climate change or a particularly hot period. And they've got this fabulously preserved body, fully kitted in a museum in Italy right now, and it's been subject to endless analysis. And what shocked them was that he was going over the pass, but he had 5 different animal types making up the leather that he was wearing. He had goat skin, he had deer skin, he had a bear skin hat, he had bear skin soles to his boots, and I think goat skin uppers. He had a sheep and goat coat. It was a really as far as researchers have proven so far, this was smoke tanned and brain tanned leather that he was wearing. Not hugely durable for those wet, snowy, freezing conditions, and his clothes show all the signs that they were repaired and continuously renewed and updated, but very, very durable for getting across the top of the mountains. Just as in places like Iceland, they only had huge quantities of fish, which are very much tanned today, but back in these early times, the raw fish skin was used for walking, for shoes. Didn't last that long, but they had plenty of them. It wasn't a worry. You could probably carry a few spares when you went out on the journey. But you go to any museum in Iceland, and you will see all these parchment fish skin shoes and other articles that people have used for centuries. So this was tanned with smoke, which they are hung. The hide's greased and softened, and you can sometimes chew it. The Inuit put enzymes in from chewing rather than using the using brains. And as I say, not hugely durable in the alpine conditions, very durable in other parts or drier parts of the world. But in the alpine conditions with the snow, not hugely durable. So he learned to repair them a lot and replace bits that were wearing out. But clearly very careful in his choice of animals for each bit. But when you start looking at some of these basic tannages, we go quickly into what went on in Japan, which seems to have been, until the middle of the 20th century, a secret hideout of ancient technologies. There's a couple of reasons for that. It's, first of all, the Japanese have tended to use fish for their protein rather than livestock. They haven't got much flat land for keeping livestock on, and they prefer to grow rice on that flat land and take their protein from the sea. So although they have some cattle, they don't have very many. And also, they couldn't go to vegetable tanning, which I'll talk about in a second, because they didn't want to cut down their trees, because as you know, Japan is quite volcanic, has a lot of earthquakes, and if you cut down the trees on the steep mountains, you get avalanches. So they refused to cut down the trees, and they stayed with the older technologies. And they made, in the town of Meiji, where they've got 3 townships around Meiji, this is a football made for the emperor, and this is what they call Meiji white leather. And it's full of normal Japanese myths and false ideas about its tannage. Sorry, it's got a dent in it. Actually did that on the way here this morning, which was naughty. This is technology that comes from where Russia, China, Mongolia intersect the Tungus River, the sort of Manchuria area, which I suspect that China's going to tell Russia to hand it back before long, because Russia took it from China in the middle of last century, and I'm hearing that China would like it back. This technology technology began there, and this is where they were doing the smoke tanning and the brain tanning and some primitive oil tanning up this whole Tumulus river. So as well as seeing it in North America, we saw these emergent technologies happening in the middle of Asia. And it went from middle of Asia through to Korea, and in the 5th century it went to Japan, and it stayed almost unchanging until 1945. And then in Meiji, the government said to the tanners, it's about time you modernized. We want you to stop using the old technology and get up to date. And everything was completely changed. What they used to do is take the hair off the hides and clean them by hanging them in the river for a few days while the hair roots loosened and they would scrape all the hair off. That was fairly common around the world, which is one of the reasons why cities tended to put the tanning community downstream so they didn't spoil the drinking water. And the ancient Romans asked the tanners to go to the mouth of the Tiber River rather than letting them tan in town. But they considered the tanners to be the number 3 guild, the 3rd most important guild that they had. But they did say, move the dirtier part of your process and well out of the way. And they then tanned them with what we think now is rapeseed oil or an oil like that, with communal stamping to get heat, and that heat dries the oil into the hide and it oxidizes it a little. And that coat on the left there from Cromwell's time, this one here, made of European buffalo hide, we were still doing communal stamping in Europe in those days to make those coats, which were worn on their own or with armour, and were very much part of the Civil War. And if you go to the new Civil War Museum in Newark-on-Trent, you'll see a lot more of these, some showing you how they were worn with armour and some without. And the generals that stayed further back didn't bother with the armour, but if you were in battle, they put some armour on. But the buffalo hide's very thick, and for a distant arrow and things, it was strong enough to stop penetration. Very important. The white here on, so this is a technology that lasted in Europe until the 16th century and continued with chamois leather. Chamois leather is made a little bit like that. In Japan, we got this very white leather, and we thought that was because it had alum in it out of the river. But actually, I think the modern belief is because they dried it like this in the beside the Ichikawa river, and the particular oil they used in the bright sunlight bleached, and we got this lovely white colour. This leather isn't hugely strong and long-lasting. This is the river today. It's changed a bit, but the tanneries are still there, but modern and doing very well. But the leather wasn't hugely waterproof, it wasn't hugely long-lasting. But most of what they were doing, they covered in Japanese lacquer from one of their trees, the sap from one of their trees, and that is really, really protective. And they made boxes rather nicer than this one that I've got that was made recently, because Meiji has one of these beautiful white castles. Was a major route when every 18 months all the nobles were asked to go up to Tokyo to pay homage, and they would stop this one, which was shown in London in the Great Exhibition in the 19th century, is typical of the way they worked on the lacquer to make fantastic effects. So these primitive tannages, these very simple ways of making them, are more important than we thought, and lasted much longer. To think that we can still talk to people, which I had the good fortune to do two years ago, whose family were making leather with these old processes into the middle of the century. And up near Tokyo, there was one town where until 1956 they were still using brain tannage until they decided it was too smelly and too dirty. And things like these samurai ancient, they have a museum up there, these ancient samurai outfits were made out of the brain and the smoke tannage. They're still doing the smoking as a staining and colouring, and to get the smell of the smoke so it feels traditional, but they're not using the ancient tanning process. So Japan is a hidden store of ancient technologies. It's really quite fun. As we move into modern technology, we have a big conflict going on about Egypt, because we've really been minded that this veg tan thing, which is all of the rest of the leather that we're looking at here in the museum, more or less, was found and uncovered first by the ancient Egyptians and was well known. And we've got sandals and other bits and pieces that we're pretty sure are of ancient veg tan. But some of the work being done actually from a student from the university right now on Tutankhamun's armour indicates it was perhaps a wee bit more like the Japanese armour, which is all of the ancient Japanese armour is all of this rather low level tanning, but covered in their lacquer to be protected. Because Tutankhamun's armour, which we've got some fabulous photos from when it was taken out in the 1920s from the tomb, when it's inspected now, it has hugely deteriorated. And she's pretty determined that it probably wasn't raw, but it was probably a fairly basic Japanese type oil tannage, and that's why it's deteriorated. And that what we're looking at here is maybe an alum tannage or an oil tannage rather than a vegetable tannage. But when you start looking at what's going on here, you're seeing somebody removing the flesh from the skin with some of the tools that you'll see along here. You see somebody softening a skin. I saw the softener, here it is here, that we use now exactly like that. And cleaning it over a beam and using an Alibaba jar. They were the wine type carrying vessels, although an awful lot of wine was carried in hides and skins in those days. And if you go to Gansu in 1987, when I was there, they were still canning in Alibaba jars, and entirely happy. This is modern chrome tanning. They should never have been doing it in Alibaba jars. Quite irresponsible. And it's one of the troubles that we have with Fez. That wonderful if they really used the old technology in Fez, but they've introduced far too many modern chemicals that they're not capable of handling. But we cannot persuade the government there to intervene and stop it being smelly and stop it being dangerous. But the idea of tanning in Alibaba jars like this is still something that we think of. This is how we used to do it in the Middle Ages in Europe. But in ancient Greece and in Rome, we know that in these alibaba jars or in pits in the grounds, we were using vegetable tannin. This is chestnut, and all those bottles along there are all the different types of vegetable materials, which, like making a cup of tea, you throw the vegetable material into water and out leaches the brown tannin. And by trial and error, you find which leaves, which bark, which wood, which galls have the highest concentration and give you the best effect. And we assume that just as when we go into a forest now and you see these lovely dark brown tannin-heavy puddles, at some stage in history, a hide or a skin was left lying in one of those and uncovered partially or totally tanned. And hey presto, we began to understand that vegetable materials gave you a fabulous leather. And you can do that, you can put in this stuff, the chestnut, you can make a sole leather that's hard like this, for which we still are one of the most important towns in the world for using sole leather on the type of shoes that are still made here, or with a mimosa type or a shoe mat, you can make something really nice and soft out of exactly the same tannage. And that's what they've been doing in high volume through history. And we know that back in Greece and Rome they knew about pine and alder. We know in Pompeii they were using skins of pomegranate. Sometimes there's confusion because some of these are also very good dye stuffs, so you're not quite sure. But we think in Pompeii that the skins kept to the side were in use in a tannery. Sumac leaves, gall nuts, acorn cups, mimosa, and also in Africa, this again from Lalibela in Ethiopia is a luncheon box, a beautiful luncheon box. That's tanned with acacia, a type of mimosa that was very common in North Africa, and which one of the tanneries in Britain is trying to reintroduce in Ethiopia right now. And this is how the tannery used to use, and it used to look, that's Pompeii, and instead of alibaba jars, they had pits that looked like that. This is, as you start moving forward to Diderot's time, you had these round pits. And you can see, if you've been to Fez and everyone's jumping in the pits, from many hundreds of years ago, we had tools that stopped you having to jump in pits and do these unhealthy things. But the people in Fez seem to think it's macho and it's good and they cannot be persuaded not to do it. So this was the common way, and this is a plunger for mixing up the chemicals that you put into the pits. And this is in Wrexham in the 16th century, and you can see in front of the house you had the pits outside, and that was very, very common until we started making sizable tanning factories in the 19th century. And you had this wonderful range of materials and items that we made out of vegetable tan, from the bellows that you see here to the covers for cases, to travelling, to chairs, everything that you could imagine, even drinking vessels. If you go to see the Mary Rose, you will see that almost every senior sailor had his own drinking vessel, because they were unbreakable. They were handed down from father to son, easy to pack, didn't matter if they got bashed a bit. Absolutely fantastic. You could have your bottle. The ones over there seem really outsized. I could only afford a little one. But I think this is more carryable, but they're really good for carrying things. Leather had an enormity of uses, and of course when the Industrial Revolution began, it couldn't have got going without leather belting. And this tannery moved forward, and it became absolutely huge by 1900 because it was making some special bands for the textile industry, and they absolutely perfected and specialized in this manufacture. So you start thinking of a huge factory with 3 wings, 300 workers up there in Wrexham, specially built to make for the textile industry when it was going full tilt after the Industrial Revolution. And I think that's a nice moment to bring to the talk the origin and growth of the leather industry, and answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a fascinating talk. We've got a bit of time for questions, so if anyone's got any questions for Mike.
Interested in the tunning in pits. What dictated the number of pits that you would use?
Well, number one, the law, because we tan in this country primarily with oak, and oak is very slow at penetrating through the hides. So we passed a law saying that it wasn't to be called leather unless it had been tanned for a year. So you had to be quite rich to be a tanner because you had to keep all this stuff in all the pits for a year. So with that number of pits, he was quite poor because you wouldn't get that many hides in. Nowadays we work more on about 3 months in a pit in a modern plant. That's actually today in Bristol, I think, in Wares in Bristol, and I think they've got about 150 pits. Certainly Bakers in Devon have got about Bakers in Devon still do oak bark tanning, and I know they've got over 100 pits for it. And you know that they're a small. I think he's got 12 employees. It's a small tannery, but it's a huge number of pits. Yes, the big vetch tans historically were very big, and it's why, say in Humphrey Davy's time, Humphrey Davy was a very senior man in terms of leather technology, because around about his time in the early 1800s, we'd been cutting down all our oak trees to build ships to fight Napoleon, and they all used to go up and talk. There were a lot of big meetings with the Prime Minister, Mr. Pitt, is how could he help the tanning industry, because he wanted leather, but he'd cut down all the trees. And what were we going to do? And Humphrey Davy was set on to look at the technology, see how you could speed it up. And he began to discover that there were other things that we ought to be using, not just importing, say, the chestnut that France was using, but going over to Singapore and bringing in things like gambia and other materials. And we did begin to start to compress that tanning time and take months away from it and bring it right down. And then, of course, at the end of the 19th century, we discovered that we could use chromium salts, and chromium salts has been the primary tanning method since after the First World War until today, although we are now beginning to look at other materials to tan with. There aren't really enough trees available sustainably to tan all the leather in the world with veg, and veg doesn't give all the properties that we need. Chromium is probably the best way to make leather right now, but because of Erin Brockovich film, which gave chromium-6 a bad name, everyone's frightened that the chromium we use, which is chromium-3, which is a dietary pill that we all eat. It's, you know, it's kind of this curious thing. You know, it's like sodium chloride as salt we eat. Sodium sulfide or sodium hydroxide are bad for us, but it's the same chemical, but we get mixed up. So we have some confusion amongst the buyers, and I don't know where it'll end, but certainly we're looking at other materials now. But it's been the great thing about chrome tanning and most of the others, so you can do that tanning in hours rather than in months. But in these big tanneries that we're trying to tan a lot of hides, you are talking about hundreds and hundreds of pits. So when I was training in that university, I was working one in my vacation, and we had an overhead crane, and you would be moving the hides from one pit to another by, using this overhead crane and hanging on the ropes as it went all down the yard, and you moved it from place to place. And I don't know how. Would you know how many pits there were at Hodgson's? Many hundreds. Yeah. It was a huge sole leather yard. And you used a lot of edge. An American tannery in the Catskills that they still talked about used to cut a square mile of forest every year. It was sizable. And they still talk about the damage that tanners did to the forests of the Catskill Mountains. But the last tannery closed in 1870. But they still talk about it.
Any more questions? Should we give Mike another round of applause? Thank you very much. Do come and have a look at Mike's objects. Also, if you could please fill out an evaluation form, we'd really appreciate it. And either give it to me or hand it in at the desk on the way out. Thanks ever so much for coming.
Thank you.